categories. Food systems, there's going to be presentations on farm to school, farm to institution programs, food hubs, economics of local food systems, food access and nutrition. And then on the sustainable agriculture side, or more related to production, we have talks on organic agriculture and organic certification, soil health, crop breeding and crop diversity, role of biotechnology in energy and biofuels. And then we have a couple talks that I guess would fall under a category of, you could call it future trends. We have one talk on urban agriculture, and then the final talk in the semester is going to be on agriculture and climate change by Laura Lennick, and some of you might have heard her when she was here last year. She gave a Sustainability Cafe talk, and it was outstanding, so we're looking forward to that. What I want to do first, before I get to my topic of the history of food systems, I just wanted to define sustainable agriculture, just so we're kind of all on the same page, because this is a sustainable agriculture food systems course. So sustainable agriculture, there are a lot of definitions out there, but one of the more simple ones that I've found is sustainable agriculture is one that produces abundant food without depleting the Earth's resources or polluting its environment. And oftentimes when we talk about sustainable agriculture, they'll mention the three pillars of sustainable agriculture: environmental sustainability, economic sustainability, and social sustainability. So obviously, environmental sustainability is important because we don't want to degrade our farm land with our agricultural practices. Economic, obviously that's important because if the farmer doesn't make a profit, he can't stay in business. And then the social aspect is also important because in sustainable agriculture, we want to ensure the viability of farm families and farm communities. So the bottom line, I think what we're talking about with a sustainable agriculture is one that's going to be preserved for future generations. But increasingly now, a lot of people are saying, well, we don't like this term sustainable agriculture because it's too nebulous. What does sustainable agriculture mean? So a lot of people now are preferring to use the term regenerative agriculture because it talks about an agriculture that not only does no harm to the land, but actually improves the land. And we can actually do that with good farming practices. And these are practices that can regenerate and revitalize the soil and the environment. And the idea is to mimic but not dominate nature. So, what we talk about when we talk about mimicking nature is we're talking about using nature services or the benefits that nature provides in our agricultural practices. So, using more of an ecosystem approach to agriculture. So things like, adding crop and landscape diversity to the farm operation, going to more perennial crops as opposed to annual crops, and with livestock, using livestock in ways that mimic the activities of animals in nature. So this is what we're talking about with regenerative agriculture, and you might, increasingly see that term more used. So I thought, for this first presentation in the course, I thought it would be good to kind of just give a brief overview of the U.S. Food system as sort of a launching pad, so to speak, for the other topics. So that's what I'd like to do with the time that I have. And so what I will be talking about is kind of the early history of agriculture in the world, agriculture in the U.S., particularly changes that have occurred in the 20th century, the industrialization of the U.S. food system and some benefits and costs to that. And then I'll finish by talking about the local food system movement as kind of an alternative to industrial food system and some trends that are happening here in South Carolina. So when I was doing some research on the history of food, I found this cite, which is actually a curriculum that was developed by the Johns Hopkins School of Public Health on the food system, and it's really a course in food systems. So they have a really good set of information on the history of food and a lot of different topics. So if you want to get into this in any more detail, I encourage you to go and check that out. So the early history of agriculture, and we know kind of what happened through archaeological evidence that they've been able to dig up, but it's generally thought that agriculture has been practiced for about 10,000 years, but it's been, widespread throughout the world really for only the last 5,000 years. And it is known that, agriculture has really spurred the tremendous growth of cities and civilizations, just because of the agriculture that was able to be developed and be more organized and coordinated and can feed more people. But we also know that there was some bad agriculture going on, I guess, probably through, trial and error. Early farmers, it's known, depleted the soil through farming practices, things like plowing and irrigation. And as an example, it's known that Rome was depleted of its soil fertility pretty much by 1 AD because of poor farming practices, and they actually had to import grain from Egypt and North Africa. And then in early Europe, the up to and through the medieval years, it was kind of a bad situation. There, farming was fairly primitive. There were periods of famine caused by poor weather and degraded soil. But then moving into the 17th century, the Renaissance period of art and culture, there really was sort of a renaissance in agriculture as well when, people started using manure for fertility and other good farming practices like crop rotation. So we started to see more efficient agriculture. But there still was some food shortages that were a result of, too rapid population growth in some of these areas. And then in the period 200 years from 1650 to 1850, the world population actually doubled from about 500 million to 1.2 billion. So that was a very rapid increase in population. But the Europeans actually benefited from crops that were imported from the Americas that provided better nutrition and prevented disease. So as soon as they had shipping, they started importing some of these crops from the Americas. Also started seeing improved processing and food preservation that helped. And then, as I mentioned, the rail and shipping routes were expanded. So all of this sort of helped to expand agriculture in Europe in these years. And then here in America, the early 20th century, the early 1900s, half of Americans were either farmers or lived in rural communities back in the early 1900s. And most of those farms were diversified. They had both crops and livestock because they needed livestock for fertility. That was before we had synthetic fertilizer. But during this time, we started to see the industrialization of America, factories popping up, cities popping up, and so we had rapid population growth, and this created a lot of perceived needs at the time to feed the industrializing U.S. economy. Also, there was a need to make farming more efficient so farmers could join the labor force. There was a thought back in those days that farming was really kind of just drudgery. And so it was better to get off the farm and maybe get a job somewhere else in a factory or a business rather than having to work on the farm. And also there was a need for cheap food so that people that worked in those factories and businesses could afford to buy the products that were produced by the factories. So a lot of change at that time. I wanted to mention the Dust Bowl era because what happened in the Dust Bowl really had a great impact on agriculture that we're still feeling in some ways today. And I'm sure you've heard about, the Dust Bowl problems with these, tremendous dust storms that just covered everything. And the causes were several causes, including, the Depression at the time. People were poor. A lot of farmers had to leave the land. A drought and strong winds, and also poor farming practices in large part created these problems. During the period 1925 to 1930, there were 5 million acres of previously unfarmed land that was plowed. So that's a huge area in the plain states. There was a great overproduction of wheat, but continuing low prices. So I think with the Depression, the farmers felt that the only way that they could make a profit was to produce more and more and more. But that resulted in a lot of them going out of business, and so there were a lot of unused fields that were left bare. Again, a lot of erosion, and that led to the dust storm problems. And also during this time, the natural drought-resistant prairie grasses were replaced by wheat. So that, again, contributed to the problem. President Roosevelt at the time enacted the New Deal with some agricultural price supports to help farmers, actually. And those price supports, some of them are still in place today. So that's what happened in the Dust Bowl is still continuing to influence agriculture in the U.S. today. The World Wars had a great impact on agriculture in this country. Probably one of the most significant things that happened was the development of the Haber process, or the Haber-Bosch process, to manufacture synthetic nitrogen or ammonium nitrate. And there was a lot of that produced during World War I, and then after the war, those stockpiles of synthetic nitrogen were pushed for agricultural use. A lot of the government agencies were pushing it to farmers for use to improve their crop fertility. So there was kind of a sentiment that, you needed to start using these synthetic fertilizers. And then in World War II, they continued policies to expand nitrogen production for explosives and also for fertilizer. But then after the war, the nitrogen plants that were funded by taxpayer dollars were turned over to companies who sold the fertilizer to farmers. So they were, kind of pushing fertilizer use. And then another thing that happened at that time were technologies that were developed for warfare, like for the development of nerve gases, were used to make pesticides. So, for example, the organophosphate pesticides and DDT were actually came out of technology and knowledge that was used to develop nerve gases. So, a lot of things changed with the war, and we saw the availability of pesticides and fertilizers, and that's really when farmers started to use synthetic pesticides and fertilizers to a great degree. Eating habits also changed after the war. From circumstances during the wars, Americans were encouraged to actually eat fresh foods because companies were making processed foods or preserved foods or dried foods and shipping them overseas for the war effort. So Americans were encouraged to grow fresh food and eat fresh food. So we saw the introduction of refrigerators and freezers into homes. Also, because the technology was there for the war effort, we saw the introduction, at that time we saw the introduction of packaged and preserved foods. So after the war, after World War II, the food industry that was making a lot of products and sending them overseas for the war effort to feed the soldiers had to shift from the sort of a war focus to more of a domestic focus. So a lot of these products that they were making, they shifted their marketing efforts to consumers. And another thing that we saw a change in during that period was the food industry started to promote specific ingredients for health and nutrition rather than whole foods, things like vitamins and nutrients and things like that. So, we also at that time saw the introduction of processed foods, things like lean cuisine. And kind of make a long story short, I think there was, a lot of information. Consumers were getting a lot of information on, what nutrients were the best for their children and their families. There were processed foods. Some of them were supposed to be healthier than others. So there was a lot of information out there, and I think consumers really were just confused by it all. So I think we started to enter an era where consumers just kind of turned off from, information on food because it was just too much to process. And then after World War II, mid-20th century, really, we started to see the advent of large-scale farming operations. So farmers, large operations were using more of a factory approach to farming to try to increase output. Things like specialization, simplification, etc., things that factories would use in their manufacturing process, those strategies were being used in farming. And we would start to see more specialized operations, pretty much on a large scale, completely separating crop production from livestock production. So, that was the advent of larger, more efficient farms. The small-scale farms, we started to see a decline. But food production doubled. We're, the most efficient agriculture on the planet. But, they started to see costs in terms of, environmental costs, public health issues, animal welfare issues, social equity issues, things that we're kind of trying to deal with today, and we'll talk about a little bit later. So, kind of to summarize the industrialization of the U.S. food system that we have today, we have some highly specialized operations where they're producing products, very uniform products, same size, weight, etc. A lot of the crops are genetically similar, livestock's genetically similar. The period from 1950 to 2000 actually doubled with a fraction of the labor. But, as I mentioned, with some consequences, we have fewer farms, but they're larger farms. And these farms are dependent pretty much entirely on off-farm inputs and on cheap energy, which is cheap now, but, is it going to continue? Is oil going to continue to be cheap? We've seen a tremendous loss in crop diversity. I mean, right now, on a large scale, we're producing corn, soybeans, wheat, are the major crops. We're not producing a lot of other crops on a large scale. And also, we're seeing a very small number of corporations sort of accounting for all of the agricultural sales in the U.S. As an example, I read that in the beef packing industry, there are only 4 corporations. They've kind of all combined, and now there's only 4 corporations that kind of control the whole thing. In terms of corn seed sales, there's only 3 corporations that are producing corn seed. So very tremendous concentration of the industry. And this is a quote from the Johns Hopkins curriculum. They say that during the last century, which is really just a blip on the whole era of our history, the food system has undergone greater transformation than in the previous 10,000 years. So it's pretty amazing what's happened in a very short period of time. So just to kind of, I guess, recap some of the benefits of industrial agriculture and criticisms. Some of the benefits, obviously, increased food production, less human labor, freeing people up to do other things, and lower food prices. And this is, I think, probably, one of the big drivers right here. people are happy with cheaper food. But some of the criticisms that people are having now there are concerns over the environmental costs. Who's going to pay for, for example, a feedlot with thousands and thousands of animals, and there has to be some way to deal with the pollution that as a result of that. Who's going to pay for that? Public health concerns, obviously the obesity problem and fast food and all that kind of stuff. And animal welfare concerns, which are very, very important these days. Also, some people are concerned that, now we have large corporations that are influencing government agriculture policy. So increasingly, farmers and the public have less control over how food is produced and sold and marketed. Also, concerns about food access and security. Some people think that this industrial system is more fragile and more vulnerable to disruption. And also the creation of food deserts, which we're seeing increasingly. This is I don't know if you can really see this, but this is a map from Centers of Disease Control publication showing these dark areas represent areas where 5 to 10% of the population live in an area where there's no supermarket store within a mile, and they have no access to a car to get to a supermarket further away. So that's becoming an increasing problem. And then some people, like this author of this book, Kitchen Literacy, Anne Valasis, I think is how she pronounces her name. She talks about the relationships between the producer and the consumer and how this has gone from kind of a relationship of trust based on communication to now a situation where there's complete ignorance. And she's saying that now there's this mutual but unspoken agreement between consumers and producers or the companies, where the consumers don't ask about production. For example, where does, chicken come from? And the producers don't answer those unasked questions. So, she's calling for more communication between the producer and the consumer. And a lot of people feel that one way to do that is to create more local or regional food systems, where the food system, all the components of the food system are contained within an area or a region. So the farming component, production, processing, distribution, access or consumption, and even the waste disposal and waste recovery all occur in the same area or region. Some people say there's like a 400-mile limit, for a true local food system. There's a lot of talk about what constitutes a local food system, but I think in general people are saying that all this should occur in the same region, and that could be, whatever. And there's an economic component to this too, definitely. I think an economic incentive. There was a study that came out of Anderson County here that was done a couple years ago that indicated that there was $500 million in agricultural sales that occurred in Anderson County every year, but most of that ended up outside of the county and even outside of the state. There was only about, I think, 10 to 12% of that actually stayed in Anderson County. So there would be an economic incentive to the area to kind of develop a more local food system. And I think what's driving this is increasing consumer demand for local and organic products. We're just seeing that. And that's been on the upswing for 10 years or more, I think, and it's continuing to increase. And so this has created market opportunities for, local farmers and businesses. And so I just wanted to talk about, kind of local food system activities and trends in South Carolina. I'm not going to talk about the whole country. There's a lot going on. But just to give you some ideas about what's happening in South Carolina, some of you probably know about more things that are going on than I do. But this is a report that was developed by the Carolina Farm Stewardship Association a few years ago, 2013. A report on local and sustainable food and farming in South Carolina. And if you want an overview of kind of what's going on in South Carolina, you can download this off their website. And it's a few years old, but and I think there's a lot of things that are new things that are happening in just the last couple years, but it'll give you an idea. And I think, one of the things that we're seeing is the creation of these small diversified farms, that we're seeing these small diversified farming operations sort of pop up and become successful that we didn't see, maybe 10 years ago, because I think the sentiment was among farmers that you can make money really with a small farming operation. But now we're seeing more of these becoming successful. I'm just going to give you one example of Greenbrier Farms. They're located just outside of Easley, and they're Greenbrier's owned and operated by Roddy and Natalie Pick and Chad and Amy Bishop. And I think the one thing that you could say about their farming operation is that it's highly diversified. So they spread the risk around throughout a lot of different market products and market strategies. So they do, beef, pork, poultry, vegetables. They have baked goods. The focus is on quality, so they can demand a high price for their products. And people know that their products are high quality. They have a real diverse kind of a marketing portfolio, so to speak. They have a farm market on their farm. They have a CSA membership program. They sell to restaurants. They sell to markets like Whole Foods carries some of their products. And they also do these farm-to-table events and weddings and wedding receptions and things like that. That's becoming an increasingly more important part of their business. So this is just one example. There's several other, or many other examples of successful small diversified farms in South Carolina. In terms of farm to school or farm to institution, South Carolina does have an active farm to institution program that's run by several organizations, the South Carolina Department of Agriculture and the Department of Education and some other organizations. And you could go to their website for more information on the South Carolina program. But I just thought I would put this screenshot up of this is a conference that's coming up, the Southeast Farm to School Conference, that's going to be held in Greenville, September 23rd and 24th. If you're interested in farm to school programs, you can register for this and attend and get more information. I think they have 1 day of field trips and then 1 day of workshops. We're seeing increasing number of restaurants that are sourcing local products and actually brag about the farmers that they work with. And one of them in the upstate, this is just one example, Bacon Brothers. How many of you have eaten at Bacon Brothers? Just one? Wow. It's really good. And obviously their focus is on meat and pork products, but they have vegetable products as well. And their chef, Anthony Gray, does a really good, he's excellent. So, but this is just one example. If you ever go down to Charleston, Charleston is just kind of the hotbed of restaurants that source local products and that advertise the farms that they source from. So this is becoming an increasingly important component of local food systems. Supermarkets as well. Probably Whole Foods here in the upstate. Whole Foods in Greenville is probably the leader in sourcing local products. They actually have what they call foragers. They go out and identify local farms that they could maybe source products from. You may know of City Roots Farm in Columbia. Whole Foods, as just an example, they sell microgreens from City Roots. They also sell milk from Happy Cow Creamery. You might have heard of Happy Cow Creamery in Pelzer. And Whole Foods, they're really, putting dollars behind their emphasis on local. They have a producer loan program that actually can help farmers who want to start a farming operation. And their hope is that they'll create more farms and more places where they can source products from. Earth Fare, they've been around for a long time. They also, Earth Fare Market is in Greenville, and they also source local. These are kind of specialty markets, sort of high-end markets, but even some of the more conventional markets like Ingalls and Bilo now are emphasizing local products. So I think this is something that's going to continue. Little local markets and cafes. I think a good example of this is Swamp Rabbit Cafe. How many of you have been to Swamp Rabbit? More people. Okay. Yeah, they source a lot of their products locally in the grocery store and the cafe, and it's almost kind of become a tourist destination for people that want to bike the Swamp Rabbit Trail to stop there and eat. The Organic Farm on Campus provides or has provided some produce to Swamp Rabbit.
Where is it?
As an example, they're in Greenville.
It's right off the trail. If you ride your bike.
Mm-hmm. And then farmers markets. Farmers markets are everywhere. Just here in this area, the Anderson Farmers Market is probably the biggest one. Downtown Anderson, but there also is one, Clemson, downtown Clemson. For some reason, they haven't been able to, get a farmers market or establish a farmers market down there. But there is one at Patrick Square in Pendleton. And then online market programs here in this area, we have the Clemson Area Food Exchange, so you can become a member for a nominal fee, and then you can order local products online and then just go to a pickup point once a week and purchase and pick up the produce. And I wanted to finish by just talking about some events that you might be aware of if you're interested in attending some of these. It's a good way to connect with people and learn more about what's going on in the state and the region. The Cultivate Conference usually occurs in March of every year, and it's at Greenville Tech. And they typically have one day of workshops, and then they have one day of kind of networking and food and things like that, and panel discussions. And so that's a good one to go to. Carolina Farm Stewardship Association has a Sustainable Agriculture Conference every year. This year it's going to be in November also in Durham. So it's not in South Carolina, but it's going to be in North Carolina. They've been going back and forth between North Carolina and South Carolina. A couple years ago they had it in Greenville. It's unclear, when they're going to come back to South Carolina, but it's a good conference. They have a day and a half of workshops, and they have farm tours and exhibits and things like that. They also organize what's called the Upstate Farm Tour that occurs in early April every year. And so for a nominal fee, you can sign up for that, and you can visit all these local farms that are in the area to get an idea of what they're doing and how they're producing. Another big conference, and a lot of these conferences have scholarships for students, so you might want to take advantage of that if you're interested. The Southern Sustainable Agriculture Workers, or Southern Agriculture Working Group Conference, SOG, is going to be in the end of January in Lexington, and a few of us went to this conference last year. It was an excellent conference. And then there's also the Organic Growers School They have a conference up in Asheville every year in March, right? And sometimes they've had one in the fall, but I think March is the big conference. So I wanted to just finish, also I guess you could call this another resource here in South Carolina, our program, the Sustainable Agriculture Program. We get funding from the USDA SARE program, Sustainable Agriculture Research and Education Program, to do training in sustainable agriculture. So we have an advisory committee made up of farmers and extension agents and other folks, and we meet once a year in December, usually in Columbia, and we discuss issues related to sustainable agriculture development and local food development in the state, and then we prioritize areas for our training workshops depending on what topics people think are most critical. So we come out of that meeting with a list of topics, and given the budget that we have, we organize these training workshops. And so typically the workshop has a classroom portion, and then we go out, usually have it at a farm location. So as an example, this is a workshop we did a couple years ago at Greenbrier Farms on pasture hog production. We went out and looked at their operation there. The Student Organic Farm on campus is part of the Sustainable Agriculture Program, and we do a lot of our training events at the farm. So it's a good venue for training, particularly in vegetable production and cover crops, which Dave Robb is involved with. So our staff is Kelly Gilkerson, who I introduced. Sean Janacek is the Student Organic Farm Manager, and David Robb, who's sitting here, is a research associate, and he's also a graduate student working on cover crop research. So we have a few minutes. I came up with some discussion points that, since we have some time, and if we have anyone who has some opinions on this, I'd just like to kind of pose this question to you, and maybe we could have a little bit of discussion, or you could think about it for later on in the semester. But just looking, given what we talked about today, looking at the future of the U.S. food system, right now, it seems to me anyway, we have, we have an industrial food system, we have big agriculture, we have conventional agriculture, and then we have this kind of local food system movement that we're seeing. And so, the question that I'm asking is, can these two different models of agriculture coexist so that, looking into the future, we'll have a choice. We can either, go to the supermarket and buy, chicken from, big chicken farms if we want to at a cheaper price, or we could, source our chicken, for example, or produce from a local producer and pay a little bit more. So, do you think, is this going to continue, or do you think one is going to outlast the other? And these are just some factors that you might think about when trying to answer that question. Economics, the environment, social justice, public health, and then the role of government in all this. So any comments? Yes, sir.
I feel like they can coexist for a while, but sooner or later it'll just go to industrial, mainly due to population numbers. Because right now, currently, we can't feed everybody with a local food system of organically or sustainably raised animals or plants entirely. There's just so many people.
Worldwide, you're talking about worldwide or in the U.S.?
In the U.S. in areas there's too many people, but in worldwide and just numbers as they're going at the rate in which they're climbing, I see local food systems doing well for a number of decades, but I don't feel like keeping up.
So eventually,
on industrialized, and then populations risen with it each way along the way.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like it's enjoy it while we've got it and do as much as we can to continue.
So eventually, the local food system movement's gonna kind of decline.
the numbers, and then they might actually have a resurgence after that too.
Okay.
Feel like a
All right.
trade-off.
I think both will continue to coexist. First, because big industry, they will keep on pressure the government, so they to exist. But also, United States will keep on its not only for humanitarian aid, but also they need some points to sell the products.
Mm-hmm.
Because of that, industrial agriculture will keep on. But people, they are aware. They are aware, and they want to. When I focus on public health, they want to know exactly what they are eating. So because
Mm-hmm.
of that, they will. Local food system with sustainable agriculture will go.
Mm-hmm.
I'm so sorry.
So do you think you think consumer preferences will maybe have a big influence on this? Like
I would
what?
say consumers' preference will go both. For those who are working, for those who their salary wage is low,
Mm-hmm.
they will keep on buying cheap food. But those who, we have the average and are aware of the kind of health issue we might have with food, they will
Mm-hmm.
go. Probably they will go with.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's been a criticism of particularly organic food production is it's too expensive and
Exactly.
People below a certain level can't afford it.
Yeah, everywhere we might see that. For example, in my country, what we try to do is we go because we have waste management, which is a municipal issue. So
Mm-hmm.
we take those garbages to produce compost.
Mm-hmm.
And to help vulnerable families grow vegetables in recycled materials.
What country?
Haiti.
Haiti. Huh? Okay. Kelsey?
Well, I just think a big part of this would be habitual change because people are used to going to the supermarket, once every few weeks and getting a ton of processed foods that will keep for all those weeks. And so I think if people just educate themselves on what's in that food and how it's being made and why it's so cheap and also I think a lot of the cheap food is also I think getting local produce is not expensive, but a lot of farmers markets in the area take food stamps and they take
Mm-hmm.
other payment programs. So I think it's people relying on industrialization and not being willing to change. Whereas
Mm-hmm.
there is change happening, and if people jumped on it, the world might actually survive, in my opinion. But,
Right. Well, so you mentioned education. So I think in the book that I mentioned, the kitchen literacy, she talks about the disconnect between the producer and the consumer, and how the information is too complicated. People just kind of they're just don't want it. Their lives are too complicated already. So how do you address that?
well, I think proper labeling probably, but also people realizing that if something sits on the counter and if it doesn't rot, it's not real food.
Ballpark hot dog buns, literally like 3 months in bag, no mold.
Yeah, and I think if people were to grasp that, I think if we made it more part of our education system, people would be more in tune to those things.
Right. Yeah.
Also, the people that want to grasp it, like people that don't care won't care.
Yeah, because I can
keep being a consumer, so it just depends on how people want to care versus.
I can tell my mom that cage-free eggs doesn't really mean much. And time after time she still just but it's cage-free.
Mm-hmm.
Like, how do you? It doesn't mean it and stuff.
Yeah. So education. Yeah.
Perhaps as
I definitely agree with that point, but I also agree with his that people are going to do what's most economic. And I'm kind of seeing or hoping for kind of a merger between the two, where the local sustainable agriculture becomes more efficient in their process, becomes bigger scale, and can eventually like compete cost-wise and production-wise with the industrial. And industrial is going to learn because the fact that it's not sustainable means that there is a failing point that will come across eventually. Hope it doesn't, but eventually, like, the unsustainability of those processes come to light, and hopefully they'll learn from the local agricultural movement and kind of move towards that. So,
do you think some like serious environmental problems are going to happen before?
That's what I'm hoping doesn't happen.
Yeah.
That it's figured out and pushed by the consumers before a tragedy has to happen. Yeah,
right.
You want to not have that. So.
But we've already had like people die from eating a burger at the Japanese box, you know? Like we've had these things, but they're shushed. They're shoved away. You know?
Yeah.
Because it's cheaper to make up for them than to change the industry.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And then also goes back to the consumer complacency, the lack of education. There's no motivation to push for a change.
Yeah.
So until a tragedy happens, where people wise up.
Yeah, which I think requires like almost a complete overhaul of the public education system. I mean, there's a complete disconnect with humans, our understanding of ourselves in the natural world. So before we address that and we understand our place in this on Earth and, you know, the impact that our behavior has, I don't think we're going to see significant change. It's only going to be the educated elite in a sense that is going to push for these drastic changes.
I love you guys. I have a question to ask. How does everybody feel about the fact that a lot of the subsidies that the big farmers are getting from the government are actually falsely giving us a false impression of the price? I mean, you're talking a lot about the economics, except we are paying more for the food that we're getting, we're just not seeing it on the shelf. So, particularly meat products.
Yeah, like
Are
on
highly
vegetarian.
subsidized. So how does that play into the way you feel about what needs to happen?
I think that shows a lot with like benefits homes or farming, something like that. And that is very scary when you look at it.
Well, the most recent farm bill, actually, they are starting to get away from commodity price supports and moving more towards putting that into insurance programs, crop insurance. So that is changing to some.
It's a whole other world of issues in its own now, because a lot of farmers will just burn their entire crop because the insurance company would have paid better than the actual market, and then they just change to a different insurance company the next year and do it all over again until they're blacklisted. That's big money. It's just taking the insurance claim.
Yeah. Yep.
I think with this, there's always going to be some form of local food system, whether it's commercialized or not, because people prefer to buy food from people they know. If they know somebody who's growing vegetables in their backyard, they'll pay to buy those vegetables if they don't want to buy it commercially. I think we're very likely to see not a complete change in industrial marketing, but some where they don't really have a franchise, but they sort of have a licensing contract with a local farmer, where that farmer supplies to them, and the local farmer gets the endorsement of the big company that people know. But then the big company has local food that they can say, this was provided by this local farm, but they still get a portion of the price for letting the farmer use their name.
That sounds like horticulture.
Like I used to work last summer at a farm over in Seneca, that they are licensed as labeled as a Purdue producer. Their chickens come from the Purdue hatcheries and go to Purdue, but they have a contract stipulation that they can sell 3 to 5% of their birds as their own. So they can license it as a Purdue quality bird, but then sell it their own to the local food system just south of Seneca, which is pretty cool. And what I'm really enjoying seeing about the local food systems especially is how they're using land that isn't good for industrial, but with crop rotation and diversified farming and stuff like that, you can get food off of what was essentially junk land. Or like what he was saying with the trash management and stuff like that, composting that, and then using the local food system in an industrial manner to do rooftop gardens and to do, literally warehouse, greenhouse systems and warehouse egg production systems that then have an outlet for the waste and compost and stuff that's going back out.
I've also seen in like the swine industry, I know, I've heard talk from a farmer in North Carolina who, he had a family farm, it was starting to go under, and what he did was he was basically bought out by a large company, and so he's no longer technically the owner, but he still manages the farm the way he always did. He just doesn't have to sell the hogs. The company takes them and processes them. So he, in a sense, got to keep his farm, but he's no longer on the line. The farm was under.
Or if they wanted to change the way that you prefer the hogs, right?
Yeah, they can have him change it some, but ultimately he is responsible for the farm. He just has to meet their requirements of what they want produced. And as long as he's doing that, they don't mess with him.
Well, just along the like the food waste, was it like 25% of our waste here is food? So I think a lot of like saying the habitual changes that need to occur is people need to buy less food and buy, refocus on nutritious food and like compost too. Because like
food waste or just bio waste?
I think it's classified as food waste.
Food waste.
Just food.
So how much is added bio waste, like paper and everything else?
Paper was a
Paper's not
recycling.
necessarily bio. It's a different category of recycling.
Usually lump food and yard waste as like bio waste.
Yeah, that's more
But
your, that's
food
more
waste
your,
itself is a huge picture.
And that, like,
it's more your,
to go into, like a solid waste management side of things, it can cause, like, horrible leachate problems, because the leachate from the landfills is acidic, which gets into your water system. So, all connected. Like, don't forget, like, you ate spinach, but then you threw half of it out. Like, you ate that local spinach, but, it's still doing waste.
Right, yeah.
I compost, I live in.
Any other comments or thoughts?
I think, go ahead, sir.
I think that with farm to school, like many pupils now, they learn to grow vegetables, but the awareness of food quality increasing day by day. Maybe this will be not really a big shift, but to go with I can't remember which idea, but we like because of that we will have those pupils starting going
Exactly.
on,
The Spartanburg City Schools just hired a farm to school coordinator who's going to be. He's got land that he can farm and where they can grow produce for the schools, and then the kids can come out and learn there. So that's kind of an exciting program, I think, that they actually use taxpayer dollars to hire this person to do the
inside the family, those children,
right,
can, like bring a change in
Yeah.
the mother.
And the other thing, I think,
This is what I want. This is what I learn.
Yeah.
and I try to keep an open mind on things that are new things that are developed. You might have seen that TED Talk by these guys that were from Silicon Valley, and they've developed this way of growing vegetables in a horticulture, aquaculture kind of a system inside these factory warehouses. And it's, the water circulates with nutrients and things like that, but it's, they're saying that this is a more sustainable way and a lower energy way to grow produce and to provide produce for a lot of people than actually growing it in the soil. So when I first saw that, I thought, well, this is like a factory, but they're actually saying this is more sustainable. So I just kind of keep an open mind on things that, I think we're going to be seeing new technologies as well. Yep.
Ant works in water tables and public works in California, and they're making a huge push in things like that have recycled water, because the system, it takes a lot of water to set up, but it uses, there was an aquaculture system that did fish, shrimp, and like 6 different kinds of greens in big factory, glass factory type things, and the cost for that, just looking at the greens, was about 40% of the water usage on just a field. And that included like the days that it rained and stuff like that they had free water, they turned off the irrigation system.
Yeah.
But just in the one season, they didn't even do the full year round. It used 40% of the water.
Yeah.
And had like 80% of the production of just those products. So
Yeah.
it's becoming really big with the water management things that are happening in certain states.
Yeah, California is a good example of that. Yeah.
I do that at home. I dug out a 12-foot by 6-foot by 6-foot pond and then did a waterfall box off the side with all the water getting circulated once per hour. The most water waste is during the summer here, just evaporation. However, the same principle is what keeps it so beneficial. Last winter, no input, didn't feed the tilapia, goldfish, and koi will all eat the algae. They siphon out the algae off their gills and just process it through. But the geothermal levels, by going 6 feet down, kept the airspace underneath just a single layer of under a single layer of poly, kept tomatoes, basil, lettuce, and beans growing all winter. And through the whole winter, it kept the air temperatures over 60 constantly. Water temperature was always over 60. This was just 15 miles from here. Waterfall box. It's in the waterfall box. The convection current of the geothermal making the water heat and take it up back through. And the waterfall was the lowest temperature point. So then you just use that and it'll keep the tomatoes going. Everything. The tomato yield is small. I think I might have one right now because I have a.
We have a party at your house.
Yeah, but no heating. No, I didn't do anything. The only thing running is the water pump. And I had solar until it broke. What?
Just want to make it water.
Okay?
Yeah.
Oh, it's the ground. The clay is over 60 degrees.
I know, I was wondering how you got good production out of 12 at 60 degrees.
Production was minimal during that time. They still grew and they still stayed alive. They didn't eat each other. They still had enough algae. It's the algae that keeps them going. And if you let them eat off algae, you get a healthy cell.
All right. Well, it's time past class time. So thanks for your discussion, and we'll see you next week.